Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Varsity Sports Live of the 2022 season. We're all going to shed a tear. Don't be sad because it's over. Be happy because it happened. Alongside Jason Andera, I'm David Brown. Jody Norstedt will join us shortly from West Fargo. And as we mentioned, we're wrapping up one of the worst weeks of the year. No more high school football, Jason Andera, but we saw a lot of awesome stuff, and we're going to honor some individual standouts.
It is. It's sad at the end of the year to see the seniors play their last game and their teams play their last game, but it's so fun to be able to highlight some of the great talent that we have both in North and South Dakota.
And you guys will get to play a part in it this year. Tell us how people can get involved in this.
Exactly. We want you guys to share with us who you think the players of the year should be in North and South Dakota. Go to our social media accounts and you'll be directed to our blog at midcosports.com, and from there you can find all the voting instructions on how to let us know who you think should be the top player in each class across North and South Dakota. We'll give you 2 finalists to pick from, but you guys want to help us out with that, that'd be great.
And it won't be controversial in the slightest.
We never hear anything bad about some of these picks or omissions, but trust me, Jody and I have spent long nights trying to figure out who we think deserves some of this recognition.
All right, we're going to give you just a little bit of time to think a little bit more about your individual standouts. You're going to join us a little bit later in the show, but right now we are going to focus on North Dakota, and for that we do bring in Jody Norstedt from West Fargo. And we'll start in 11AA. And the theme all year from a team perspective is no one really wanted to be number one. The number one teams kept falling off. A lot of great individual standouts, though. How did that parity among the teams affect some of the great individual performances this year?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, David. There was just incredible balance amongst teams and amongst talent, which made it a tough job to trim this list down. And for the Class A schools, we decided to go with 2 finalists and then 5 honorable mentions. And here's a look at what we came up with after talking to coaches, media, and of course, doing our own homework, as Jandy alluded to. We lead off our 11AA honorable mentions list with the EDC Senior Athlete of the Year, Josh Ballstead, a senior fullback and linebacker out of West Fargo on Friday nights. Boy, you could hear his name called out over the PA system like the guy announcing was stuck on repeat. He's been a tackling machine throughout his career. After leading the state with 100 tackles as a junior, followed that up with 83 tackles to lead the state again this year despite missing the regular season finale and playoff game. Number 35 also racked up 7 tackles for loss and a pick 6 this season. We go back to the eastern side of the state for our next honorable mention, Davies senior linebacker and slotback Oliver Lucht. The NDSU commit rarely left the field for Wayne Wehrmeyer's Eagles. Lucht finished the year with 488 rush yards, 420 receiving yards, and 15 combined touchdowns. He also ended up with close to 50 tackles, including 9 for loss. No player had more non-passing touchdowns on the season than Lucht in the EDC 11AA. He plays with passion and punishment. I don't know if there was a more exciting player to watch in 11AA than West Fargo's senior receiver and defensive back Peyton McGregor. After waiting in the wings behind Carson Hagerly last fall, Hagerly of course with the Bison now, McGregor erupted for a massive season, turning 42 catches into an EDC best 784 yards and 5 touchdowns. He has the speed, the hands, the toughness. He can adjust to balls better than many college receivers. McGregor just had the knack for the big play. He also made 30 tackles on defense with 3 picks and a kick return score as well. Future Golden Gopher Carter Menz may not have reached his lofty goals heading into this season, but a state best 10 sacks and 18 tackles for loss is nothing to sneeze at for the Cheyenne Mustang. Menz racked up a combined 48 tackles on the year, and that's with him, keep in mind, fighting double teams on a consistent basis, and then teams simply just trying to scheme him out of plays by running away from him, running at him. Menz helped the Mustangs still have the top scoring defense in the state. Next up is Mandan's Lincoln Wiseman, who admittedly is my number 3 player on this list. Wiseman set the tone for everything the Braves wanted to do offensively. He rushed for over 1,300 yards and a state best 17 rushing touchdowns in 9 games. Remember, he missed some time because of a wrist injury he suffered against Minot, and then he put a stint on his wrist along with some extra padding and said, I'm just going to keep on playing. He rushed for 222 yards and 3 touchdowns in that quarterfinal win over West Fargo, and it was big all season long for Todd Sheldon's group. Now to our pair of finalists. It's Wiseman's teammate Carson Jablonski. The 6'1 senior made the honorable mentions list last year following a 1,000-yard receiving season. What did he do for an encore as a senior? How about another 1,000-yard receiving season? Jablonski was a game breaker all year. In the first 3 games of the season against Davies, Century, and Minot, 3 very good defenses, he finished with at least 130 yards receiving and a touchdown in each game. In all, he ended up with 1,024 yards and 6 touchdowns on 45 catches. He also scored 1 rushing touchdown, 1 punt return touchdown, 1 kick return touchdown, 1 pick six, and 1 slice of salami. After that, he had a stomach ache, an ode to the Very Hungry Caterpillar book, one of my son's favorites. Point being, he did it all this year for the Braves. The other finalist is the state championship winning quarterback Michael Rosberg from Shanley. The St. Thomas commit tossed 3 or more touchdown passes in 7 of the Deacons' 12 games. He finished about 30 yards shy of passing for 3,000 yards. Are you kidding me? He tossed 34 touchdown passes, rushed for 9 more while being intercepted just 7 times. Now, a lot of people were questioning how good the Deacon offense would be after graduating John Gores and Aiden Devine, who combined for 3,500 yards last season. That question got answered early and often. Rosberg, well, he helped recruit some basketball players like Vachiri Hakim and Connor Kraft to come back out for football. And look what happened. The 6'4" strong-arm quarterback put a bow on his season by combining for 6 touchdowns in the state championship victory over Century. 2 great candidates, David, in Jablonski and Rosberg. Those 2 are your finalists.
And obviously, when you get these teams with so many great individual standouts like you had with Mandan, how would you pick between Wiseman and Jablonski for your finalist spot?
It was brutal, and I think I swapped their spots about 4 or 5 times over this past week. I was pretty split on it. The coaches I visited with were pretty split on it. I think in the end, Jablonski, following up a 1,000-yard receiving season with another one, in addition to his impact on special teams and defense, helped give him the slight edge. As for Rosberg, the decision to name him a finalist only became easier as he surged in the postseason. In the 3 playoff games, he completed 67% of his passes, averaging 316 yards a game, threw 10 touchdowns and rushed for 4 more, while only throwing just the 1 interception. Pretty outstanding play in the midst of a championship run. And as wild as 11AA was this season, David, 11A was up there too. 3 different teams were ranked number 1 throughout the regular season, and a 4th different team, Fargo South, was the top seed entering the playoffs. Competitive football brought out the best in this level, and here are the best of the best, beginning with the honorable mentions. Our honorable mentions list in 11A begins with Double G from Valley City. That's senior running back and defensive back Gavin Gerhardt, who rushed for 1,000 yards and scored 13 touchdowns for a Highliners team that spent multiple weeks at number 1. Now, Gerhardt also was a difference maker on defense, 8.5 tackles for loss and 4 picks to prove it. Central's Dylan Lamont helped the Knights make huge strides this season, getting their most wins in 15 years. The senior QB led the EDC with 2,200 passing yards and 18 touchdowns. Lamont's biggest moment of the season was, of course, that touchdown throw he made to Leo Strandell in double overtime to help the Knights knock off number 1 Valley City. We don't have sophomores on this list very often, especially at the Class A level, but Wapaton's Trayton Mauk had a special year. He delivered with over 1,000 all-purpose yards and 9 touchdowns on offense. He was the best return man in 11A with a couple that he took back for touchdowns, and he finished 3rd in the EDC in tackles and led the conference with 5 interceptions. The future is bright for number 44. Colton Schneider nabbed EDC Senior Athlete of the Year honors thanks to his great 2-way play. Like Mauk, he got it done on both sides of the ball. Nearly 1,000 yards rushing and over 50 tackles on defense. A pretty strong case could be made for this next guy to be Player of the Year. Senior receiver and linebacker Jackson Walters was as good as anyone in 11A. He turned 41 catches into 865 yards and 13 touchdowns for Jamestown. Then on defense, he led the state with 100 tackles, 59 of those being solo. He's as good on the field as he is off of it, one of the nicest athletes I've interviewed. He deserves to be right in the mix with these final 2. His teammate Peyton Hochhalter from Jamestown, and this guy, the junior running back and linebacker Peter Haugel from Fargo North. Haugel averaged 7 yards per carry for the Spartans and racked up over 1,400 yards on the ground. He shattered the school record for rushing touchdowns in a season with 25 of them. And despite taking a beating from defenders every Friday night, he still dished out some pain of his own on defense with 12 tackles for loss and 4.5 sacks. Haugel guided the Spartans to their first state championship game appearance in over 20 years. Opposite him is the other finalist, Hochhalter, the standout senior QB from the now back-to-back state champs. And for the season, the University of Jamestown commit passed for 2,600 yards and a state best 34 touchdowns. He also rushed for 10 scores, and in limited time as a defensive back, he intercepted 6 passes, 2 of which happened in that state championship game. And speaking of that championship game, Hochhalter set a new Dakota Bowl record by scoring 7 touchdowns, 3 passing, 3 rushing, and 1 receiving. Great arm strength, great athleticism, and great decision making are the leading attributes for Hochhalter as a finalist, David. 2 good ones in that division.
And of course, those 2 finalists played in the state championship between Fargo North and Jamestown. So put on your lawyer cap. How would you make a case for both Haugo and Hochhalter?
I plead the 5th, right? No,
Yeah,
for
exactly.
Haugo, the offense ran through him, right? He had 8 100-yard rushing games and had 7 games with multiple touchdowns. More than anything, he was outstanding in the postseason. For Hochhalter, I feel like the state championship game speaks for itself, right? What a signature game to finish your career on with 300 yards passing and 7 touchdowns. Absolutely dynamite.
Yeah, kind of hard to argue with 7 touchdowns, but that's why we're going to let the people decide. So
Yeah.
That's 2 classes in the books for you, 2 more to go. When we come back, wait until you see some of these video game numbers that were put up in 11B and 9B in North Dakota. Jody's going to reveal his Player of the Year finals and honorable mentions when we come back.
You're watching Varsity Sports Live, presented by Andera Orthopedics. Welcome back to Varsity Sports Live, presented by Farmers Union Insurance.
And welcome back to the season finale of Varsity Sports Live. We'll go back up to Jody Norstedt. And Jody, we know the Class B schools have extremely passionate fan bases, so plenty of intrigue with 11B. What made that season so special in Class 11B?
Yeah, thanks, David. I just think week after week we saw dynamite football games and outstanding performances. I think back to some of our game ball winners from earlier this year, like Trinity's Jace Kovash. He had 300 yards and 5 touchdowns in his first varsity start. Botano's Ryder Pullman, Ray Powers Lake superstar Tyson Engett each earned one. And shout out to the linemen that are often overlooked for some of these accolades. Kindred had some great ones. Jack Packer, Riley Sunram, Kyle Sandy from Velva was a beast. Jack Rumfo from Langdon, and you'll wonder if things would have turned out differently for Central Cass had Tyler Cruchet not left the state championship game early with an injury. He was a great lineman as well, but went down early in the Dakota Bowl. But let's get to the honorable mentions for Player of the Year in 11B. Trinity's Ty Dassinger is one of the 2 Titans that cracked the list for me. Dassinger was a key piece to that electric offense, rushing for nearly 1,000 yards, amassing over 400 yards through the air, 23 touchdowns. He was also one of the top tacklers in the state, finished with 6 sacks on the season. Shiloh Christian senior QB Joey DeSeer passed for 2,000 yards and 27 touchdowns. Give him 11 more on the ground. Might as well call him Joey Ballgame. He helped the Skyhawks really soar this fall. Tyson Engett is one of those players where your jaw drops every time you see a Ray Powers Lake box score or if you watch some highlights. 11 passing touchdowns, 14 rushing scores, 58 tackles for the region's senior athlete of the year, and he only played in 7 games due to an injury. I always wonder how much the Outlaws could have done some damage in the postseason had he been healthy. Junior quarterback Jace Kovash was the maestro of the Trinity Titans' electric offense. He passed for over 2,000 yards, and I love his touchdown to interception ratio, 29-4. Kovash helped the Titans garner their most wins since 2009. Mason Melmer was the one to carry Beulah's offense this fall. I'm fairly certain he was the only 2,000-yard rusher in the state. If not, go ahead and hit me up. Melmer scored 23 touchdowns in all, made 7 tackles for loss on D. And then Botano, boy, they moved back up to 11-man and continued to sling the ball all over the place. Senior Ryder Pullman broke the school record for passing yards with over 1,700. He tossed 26 touchdowns to his elite weapons like Carson Herrera and Jacob Shriver. And then you got Thompson sophomore Jake Starcevic. He earns a spot on the list after being possibly the only player in the division to pass for over 1,500 yards and rush for over 1,000 yards. In all, he scored 27 offensive touchdowns for the Tommies. He was a baller on defense too, making 53 solo tackles and 4 interceptions, including a pick 6. His varsity career, guys, has just taken off. So look out. Central Cass's own Wiersma went out with a bang, leading the Squirrels to their first Dakota Bowl appearance since 1980. Wiersma averaged just over 7 yards per carry en route to piling up 1,300 yards on the ground. He had one heck of a career for Tommy Butler's program. Now to our finalists. We begin with a guy who won this award last year as a junior, Kindred's Trey Heinrich. Remember, he was coming off shoulder injury heading into the year, but that didn't seem to faze him this fall as he put up great numbers again, finishing with 1,100 rushing yards and 24 combined touchdowns. He was a tackling machine too for that stout defense that led all of 11B in points allowed. The other finalist is a sophomore and a darn good one at that. His second year as a starting QB, and Ben Shep guides Velva Drake Animus Garrison to the state championship. He completed 70% of his passes for 1,800 yards and 21 touchdowns against just 4 interceptions. He also added over 500 yards rushing and 14 scores, and he played both ways, recording 50 combined tackles and a trio of interceptions. Shep finished the job inside the Fargo Dome, and that matters, accounting for over 300 yards of offense and all 3 Aggie touchdowns. The sophomore, David, was simply sensational this season for Larry Sandy's group.
And we talked about and we joked video game numbers, but honestly, when you see all these eye-popping stats from all these players, inevitably there's going to be some guys that get left off of this list. So who was kind of right on the fringe for you? Didn't quite reach those video game numbers.
Yeah, and I went from 5 honorable mentions in Class A to we did 8 for Class B. So even extending it a little more to try to fit some of these players, just because there are more teams, obviously, in 11B and 9B. I think of the duo of Xavier Vossler and Adler Paper at Oaks. They have a legitimate gripe. Paper averaged 28 yards per catch this season, which is incredible. Vossler passed for 26 scores. You got Lisbon's Bowden Greenlee, who had an outstanding season as well. It's just so tough to make these lists. Those guys I just mentioned are exceptional too, though. Now it's time as we take a look at the best players in 9B, starting with our honorable mentions, 8 of them. He was a sophomore, but West Hope Newburgh Glenburg quarterback and defensive back Walker Broughton has some undeniable talent. Not many high school players can claim they passed for 1,500 and rushed for 1,500 yards in the same season, not to mention the 45, count them, 45 combined touchdowns, which includes a couple of defensive scores. Broughton, one of the best athletes in the state. Of course. Divide County's Wyatt Carabello has been a household name on our top performers list the last few years. He was a 1,000-yard rusher for his senior year and also made an impressive 60 solo tackles for the Maroons. Zyler Carlson from Mayport CG was good for about 12 yards per carry this season. That's ridiculous in itself. Carlson finished with over 1,500 combo yards on offense, hit the end zone 24 times if you include his pair of defensive touchdowns, also had double-digit tackles for loss. Carlson, just an outstanding senior season for him. Senior lineman A.J. Hines from New Salem Almont, boy, was he good. What a year for him, and a great college prospect as well. He finished with over 50 tackles, including 15 tackles for loss and 6 sacks on offense. Remember, they ran a lot behind number 50, and they ran for 4,000 yards on offense this season, if you can believe that. Impressive stuff. Maple River's Clay Hovelson earned a game ball earlier this year. Makes the honorable mentions list, too, after rushing for over 1,500 yards. Hovelson was a tackling machine, 69 solo tackles on the year. Colton Ness has been making all-state teams since he was a sophomore. The Lemoore Litchfield Marion senior tight end continued to be a threat from anywhere on the field. He caught the ball 20 times, turned half of those into scores. Ness had 52 tackles, 6 picks on defense. Keep in mind, he didn't have to play a lot in second halves of games with so many lopsided scores throughout the year. And when you talk about elite defensive players in 9-man, the conversation has to start with Jacob Steele, a Cavalier. He finished the season with well over 100 tackles, including 16 for loss, 8 sacks on offense, 700 yards, 16 touchdowns, 230 receiving yards, and 4 scores. Pretty darn impressive for him. Ty Wolding, he shared the field with Steele in the 9B championship game. The senior QB for New Salem passed for close to 1,000 yards, rushed for another 800, and accounted for 27 touchdowns. Piled up 76 tackles on defense, too. A lot of grit from Wolding this season. Our finalists combined for, listen to this, 63 touchdowns this season. Boy, 2 super impressive seniors, leading off with North Prairie superstar Nicholas Mears. The Cougars quietly stacked wins all year, came up just short in the semifinal round against the eventual state champ New Salem. Defenses, though, were never able to solve Mears. He passed for 640 yards and 9 touchdowns and just killed teams with his speed, rushing for 1,800 yards and an eye-popping 31 touchdowns. He was like the Michael Vick of 9B football. He averaged an incredible 12 yards per carry, also made 43 stops on defense with 6 interceptions. Mears is a dual threat quarterback. Landon Carter is a dual threat playmaker for Cavalier. When he wasn't stressing defenses with his 700 rushing yards and 11 scores, he was beating them through the air, hauling in 45 passes for over 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. Carter set 5 new receiving records for Cavalier High School this fall, including 3 that were held by former UND standout Brady Trenbeth. And then on defense, Carter, 50 tackles, created 12 turnovers, including 9 interceptions. The 3-time All-State pick was also named Senior Athlete of the Year in that 9B division. So no doubt about it, I'm going with Carter and Mears for our 9B finalists.
And even among those 9B finalists, you mentioned some of those great honorable mention players and some of their eye-popping numbers. Any of them surprise you this season?
I'd say maybe Clay Hovelson from Maple River. We just didn't know a lot about what that co-op would look like, and he goes out and has a big year. Zyler Carlson transitioning from Finley Sharon Hope Page to Mayport CG after FSHP kind of dissolved, and boy, what a year he had for the Patriots. And I think Mears, to an extent, I mean, he got injured as a junior, missed a couple of games, and he comes back, and boy, what a season he has. And we're still talking about him. If North Prairie is able to knock off New Salem, maybe it's the Cougars that are ending up winning the championship. They'd still have to go through Cavalier, but that was a pretty darn good team up there for North Prairie this season.
Jody, thank you as always. Awesome stuff all season long. And a reminder to everyone, voting is now open, so tell Jody how you feel. You can weigh in on who you think deserves to be the player of the year in each of the 4 classes by voting between the 2 finalists. Thank you so much, Jody.
You bet.
Information again can be found on our website and our Midco Sports social media channels. And when we come back, Jason Andera will come and rejoin the set. We'll break down the contenders for South Dakota Player of the Year honors in their 7 classes.
You're watching Varsity Sports Live, presented by South Dakota State University. Time now for Varsity Sports Live, presented by Andera Orthopedics.
And welcome back to VSL. Jason Andera back now. We're going to break down the best of the best individually in South Dakota now. We'll start in the 9-man ranks with 9B.
Yeah, we'll go small to big. And 9B, this was a class that was super entertaining this year, but it's dominated on my list by the 2 teams that made it to the Dome. And let's get started, though, with the one player who didn't make it to the Dome. Waylon Bowl of Corsica Stickney. He turned up aces as a freshman this year, over 1,500 yards from scrimmage, and he was their most consistent player on defense. I know he's probably not going to get a lot of recognition around the state because he's a freshman, but trust me, this guy is the real deal. Then Carter Binger, the quarterback for Hitchcock-Tulare, he had them resurgent. He missed a couple of years of his high school career due to injuries, but he came and showed out as a senior. 1,843 yards passing, 28 touchdowns, and 10 more rushing. A great year on defense as well for Carter Binger. Speaking of quarterbacks, let's go to the quarterback on the other side of the field in the championship game, Trey Heddick. He was probably the most underrated part of the Wolverines' offense this year. He threw for over 2,000 yards, and that was with a back next to him that gained almost 3,000 yards. That's hard to do, but Trey Heddick had a brilliant senior season. How about a TJ Solomon, the senior lineman for Hitchcock-Tulare? This guy saw double teams all season long, still came up with 10.5 sacks and 16.5 tackles for loss. When opposing coaches really concentrate on Hitchcock-Tulare, they are looking at TJ Solomon.
But for your 2 finalists in 9B, one of them is pretty obvious from Harriet Selby, but the other one, you kind of had a hard time picking between guys on Hitchcock-Tulare, but another Patriots, your other finalist.
Exactly. I had people throw out Binger and Solomon, but I went with Landon Puffer as my finalist because he just did everything. He was electric on the field. He saw really good defenses and still was their leading receiver on the year. He had 14 interceptions on defense, David, and 7 punt return touchdowns. That's almost unfathomable what kind of impact you can make when you're doing that on defense and on special teams and on offense. This guy was the best player on the field, in my opinion, whenever Hitchcock-Tulare laced him up.
And then, of course, for Harriet Selby, you have to mention Brendan Megaman.
Well, he had a season unlike any we've seen in South Dakota. Set the single season record for most rushing yards in a season with almost 3,000, just shy of 3,000 yards rushing, and then set the career record, which honestly I thought was out of reach this year. But when you rush for almost 3,000 yards, you can get to over 6,800 yards rushing. He's now recruited and now committed, to SDSU. to play football next year. And I'll never forget how he gutted out that final performance at the Dome. He was playing with about a 50% hamstring and still gained 188 yards.
So it's Begman and Puffer as your finalists in Class 9B. Moving to 9A, Gregory and Warner in that championship game. We're going to see a bunch of players from the Gorillas and the Monarchs in your honorable mentions, but some other guys as well in 9A.
Yeah, excellent. We're going to start with that list of honorable mentions in alphabetical order with Noah Kleinsasser. And this guy on defense maybe was the MVP of the class. He had a big year on defense, but for him to be that good on defense and produce 1,200 yards of offense in 10 games, that makes him an honorable mention. How about Cooper Long of Lyman? Transferred from Garrettson to Lyman this year, and he kind of had this team resurgent, got them a home game in the semifinals, caught 50 passes for 891 yards. He was a tremendous boost to the Raiders this year. Ashton Schuhart, he was the heart and soul of a Warner defense. This defense, they held opponents to their worst scoring game in 5 different times this year, and he was the reason why on that defense, and he also came up big with some huge plays at the Dome, getting some touchdowns on their comeback as they tried to get closer to a 9A championship.
But the teams in 9A will represent the 2 finalists in Gregory and Warner. It's a couple of dual threats on offense.
Dual threats, yeah, in Hunter Kramer's case, probably triple threat. This guy is a threat of every single kind, and they're both juniors. But let's talk about him. Hunter Kramer, an amazing athlete. He would move wherever Coach Hayline needed him. Receiver, runner, quarterback, defense, special teams. And I'll remember that big second half that he had to lead Warner back after they were losing at halftime to Canastota and answered with 32 straight points. That's one memory that just sticks in my mind with what he did this year. But Rylan Peck, the junior quarterback out of Gregory, he deserves some recognition as well. This guy was explosive. 40 touchdowns running and passing this year, and a solid year. Over 1,000 yards passing, over 1,000 yards rushing, and you can just tell when he steps on the field, he's the guy you got to pay attention to.
Well, I joked, you shouldn't be Rylan Peck, you should be Rylan Bushel based on how much he gets into the end zone.
He's worth at least a bushel.
Absolutely. Let's move on now to 9AA. Wall winning its first state championship since 1994, and there are some Eagles on your list.
Definitely some Eagles on this list. This is the best team they've had since 1994, as you mentioned. 3 honorable mentions I want to talk about first, and one is the Wall quarterback, Burke Blasius. Maybe the most accurate passing season of a dominant quarterback I've seen ever. He hit on nearly 75% of his passes at 19 yards per completion with just 2 interceptions. He was very laser sharp all season long. Luke Frazier of Hamlin, he was the top rusher in the entire class. He's just a junior, 18 rushing, 7 more through the receiving. That's a huge year for that Charger. How about Riley Rochadle? He ran for over 1,000 yards from his quarterback position, just one of the best overall athletes, and his coach Byron Pedwell tells me he's one of the smartest players he's ever coached.
And your 2 finalists include a state champ from the Wall Eagles and also a dual threat quarterback.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing that comes in handy when you're having 9-man football, is a guy who can do a lot, and both of these guys can do a lot. Let's talk about Cedar Amiot first of Wall. This guy, you have to look past the stats, and this is the guy that you want leading your team. He plays both ways. He's the long snapper. He returns kicks, and he plays like a warrior. He had significant injuries in the last couple of weeks, and they didn't tell anybody, but he had some slip discs that he played with in the championship game and still found a way to shine. He is a true warrior and helped Wall bring a title home. How about Ryan Krogh, though, of Elkton Lake Benton? The offense ran through Ryan all year long. He had 9 of his 11 games. He rushed for over 100 yards as the quarterback, and he passed for 1,700 on the season. No one put up numbers like Ryan Krogh did this year, and he really vaulted that team to levels they have not been in recent history.
So Amiot and Krogh are your finalists. And by the way, no disrespect at all to Parkston, by the way. No individual players from Parkston on your list. They were the finalists along with Wall, but that just kind of goes to how big of a team Parkston was all season long.
A true team effort, and they have a couple juniors that I thought about with Braden Jervik and Will Jadozi, but they've got a lot of young talent coming back next year. I have a feeling we're going to see some Parkston Trojans on this list next year.
All right, so that's 9-man. Let's move on to Class 11B. Elk Point Jefferson tops winner in a great game down at the Dome, and we see both teams represented on your lists.
Yeah, exactly, and it's really hard to decipher in 11B because there's such great defenses, but we put a lot of emphasis on stats and offenses, but a lot of these guys play both ways, and we're going to start with one of those guys, Lucas Heiser. He had his biggest game of the season in the Dome. Now, quantity-wise, it wasn't his biggest game, but he came up huge as his team, Elk Point Jefferson, upset winner. He ran for 119 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game. He's a true all-around player for the Huskies. How about Preston Iverson of Hot Springs Oak? This guy was so fun to watch. He was impossible, nearly impossible to stop, especially in the playoffs. One of the most memorable playoff runs I'll remember as they knocked off Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan. Not many people thought they could do that. And then they knocked off Aberdeen Roncalli, a team that was giving up 3 points per game, and they went out and put up 4 touchdowns on them. So a really great year, headlined by their quarterback, Preston Iverson. Riley Orrell, an outstanding career, and it's really hard to put numbers on winner players because they share the ball so much and they blow so many teams out that they really spread the wealth, and he got a lot of that wealth this year. Maybe the most versatile player in the class, 12 offensive touchdowns, and he was a punt return nightmare, just a really good player on special teams. How about Reed Russ out of Mount Vernon Plankinton? He was a load to bring down the quarterback who goes over 200 pounds. A 4-year starter. He led MVP in yards. He led them in tackles. This is a guy who I think can play really well at the next level, but really dominated in his senior year.
And you just mentioned it. Sometimes stats kind of makes these lists hard to decipher, hard to pinpoint. But your 2 finalists, it wasn't always necessarily the stats, but a lot of intangibles for your 2 finalists.
You got to go deep into the intangibles, and this is where I get a lot of help from the coaches because you can't just look at the numbers here. A guy like Aiden Barfus of Winter, this guy, just a junior this year, missed his freshman year due to a lot of injuries, came back with a huge sophomore year being the Joe Robbie MVP, and then as a junior, the numbers don't explode, but 8 yards per carry, 18 touchdowns. He also averaged 42.5 yards on kick returns. And then you can't put a number on what he did defensively. This Winter defense has been epic for years, and he was the heart and soul on that defense. So Aiden Barfus definitely deserves to be a finalist. And how about Ben Swadek? Take your pick between Swadek and Heiser. I mean, you look at their numbers, and they're so similar for Elk Point Jefferson. But after just talking to a lot of people around the class, it was Swadek is the guy that you got to give the edge to, primarily because of what he did on defense. And this is a defense that gave up less than 4 points per game up until the championship game. And he was the leader both on and off the field for Elk Point Jefferson. And he really set the tone in the weight room, which really exploded this team as one of the top teams to watch for.
Obviously, EPJ cemented their status with a championship, but you're right, that defense, especially the start of the season when they were pitching consecutive shutouts, that really helped Elk Point Jefferson stand out this year.
Oh, yeah. They went, over half the season without giving up a single point. And it was great because they could rotate so many different players in, and they could rotate 2 backs with Heiser and Swadek. But remember, they both played both sides of the ball, too. So these guys got a lot of work. And but it's Swadek who I really feel like is one of the best players in this class.
By the way, very sly to mention that you got advice from coaches. So if you're upset with this, don't blame you.
Yeah.
Blame the coaches that told you that these players are better, right?
I do. I try to do my due diligence, talking to analysts, coaches, and other people who've watched these games all season long. So we do our best to give you the best accurate information.
And it's all love. We love every high school player as is. But anyway, when we come back, we're going to break down Class 11A, 11AA, and 11 AAA. Lots of tough decisions to be made with those individuals on those lists. We'll find out what they are next.
You're watching Varsity Sports Live, presented by Farmers Union Insurance. Welcome back to Varsity Sports Live, presented by South Dakota State University.
Welcome back. It is the season finale of Varsity Sports Live. David Brown with Jason Andera. We are going through the best of the best in North Dakota and South Dakota. Individual standouts, player of the year candidates. And you guys have a voice. Jandy, tell them how.
The voting is now open. Go to any of our social media accounts and you'll be able to be directed to our blog at midcosports.com. And on that blog, you can read about all of our honorable mentions, all of our finalists, but more importantly, you'll be directed to the one place that you can vote to say who you would have as the player of the year on our Instagram account. So yeah, just find us at midcosports.com, click on the blog, and check that out.
All right, we've gone through 4 classes in South Dakota. The final 3 starting in 11A. West Central and Del Rapids met in the championship. The Warriors finished off an undefeated season with the win over the Trojans. And now we will see who's on your honorable mention list in 11A.
11A was stacked with talent. Not a huge class of teams, but a huge class of talent. And we're going to start with Avery Herding. This guy was my preseason player of the year, but he had to pop his shoulder in and out most of the season.
Ouch.
And was still able to put up some amazing numbers. 12 tackles for loss, 7 sacks. He's the all-time leader in Canton with career sacks. He's over 36 for his career. So Avery Herding, he really gutted it out this year, but he belongs as one of the best players in 11A. Randy Rosenquist, he was one of the most exciting players in the class. He hauled in over 100 yards receiving, over 1,000 yards receiving, and was one of the best defensive players in the class with 5 picks and 10 pass breakups, and a huge improvement for Dakota Valley this year. A lot of that due to the consistent play of Randy Rosenquist. How about Mason Stubbe? He was an animal. He grinded out 22 touchdowns and led his team to the championship. Probably one of the most important parts of this Del Rapids team was the way they ran the football, and nobody ran it more or better than Mason Stubbe.
And of course, our 2 finalists in 11A fittingly come from our 2 team finalists, one from West Central, one from Del Rapids.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's hard to pick on Del Rapids who should be the player that represents your class as one of the best players. Well, I thought it was Braden Panconen. This guy was versatile. He was able to do it receiving. He was able to do it rushing. He was one of the best defenders in the state. Whether he needed a block, a tackle, a catch, it didn't matter. Braden Panconen came up with it. He ended up with over 900 yards from scrimmage, and he was a true X factor on defense as well. But the theme that kept coming up over and over talking to 11A coaches was West Central has Justin Zerpel and no one else does. Zerpel continued to improve throughout the year, and they had nothing but great things to say about this guy who was a running back turned quarterback, and really he had problems turning the ball over early in the year, got much better as the year went on, and ended up one of the best statistical seasons of anybody in 11A, but also just one of the best players in 11A.
So it's Zerpel and Panconen as your finalists in Class 11A. In 11AA, of course, Pierre won its 6th straight championship over T-Area. Another phenomenal game between the Governors and the Titans. But some other guys in 11AA from some non-Pierre and T-Area teams make your honorable mention list.
Exactly, because we know this is a very deep class of talent as well with so many people. And when I think defense, I really thought about Jackson Neck. I know you did too. Every time he called a Brookings game, he popped off the page defense.
Number 6 was just flying all over the field.
He was the best tackler in the class, and according to his coach, maybe the best leader in his class as well, putting up some really sick numbers. And he also played some offense too and scored a couple touchdowns on the year. How about Juven Hudson of Watertown? He only played in 8.5 games. He was injured a couple games, but he still averaged over 140 yards per game that he did play. And his coach, John Hodorf, said his work ethic is what sets him apart. Over 1,200 yards on the season for the junior running back. And then how about Rugby Riken? I mean, this guy was the most fun player to watch in the entire class. I mean, we all know Lincoln Keenholz had a fantastic year, and he kind of overshadows what Riken did. But some of the plays he made were just crazy. He was a dynamite player. He threw for over 2,600 yards and rushed for 723 yards on the year. And Yankton, congrats to them. They had a huge improvement this year as well because of what their senior quarterback did.
And of course, the 2 finalists come, one from Pierre, one from T-Area. T, a little more difficult because they had that great running attack for Pierre. It's pretty much no question. I think everyone knows who your finalist is from Pierre.
Well, we'll go in alphabetical order. It's Lincoln Keenholz as one of my finalists. Surprise, right? But what more can you say? People call him the GOAT for a reason. The all-time leader in touchdown passes in any class, the all-time leader in passing yardage in any class. But I thought the most crazy thing that he did this year was rush for over 1,300 yards. He was the primary ball carrier for a team that threw the ball better than anybody else in the class. And not to mention, in all the big games this year, he played defense, and he came up with some key interceptions on defense as well. Every coach I talk to says this guy is special. He's maybe not maybe is the best player we've ever seen in South Dakota high school football, for sure, in recent years.
And of course, he's playing at the University of Washington next year.
Going to head to Washington next year to see what he can do in the Pac-12. His competitor in this class and another super versatile player, Chase Van Tol. And this guy's going to play at SDSU next year, and he's going to play linebacker. But linebacker was not his primary position in high school. His primary position was running the football, and this is something he did very well. You mentioned it. So many different running backs in this T offense could get it done, but it was the leader, Chase Van Tol, when they needed the big yards and they needed to turn out big plays. He did it. And then he came up with 2 huge receiving touchdowns in the title game, kind of added to his resume of versatility. And then we all know about his defense as well, and that's what he plans to do at the next level. But he was also one of the best kickers in the state.
He can kick 50-yarders.
He can kick 50-yarders. He made a 46-yarder in the playoffs. He was very dependable in the kicking game as well. So you talk about complete players. You got 2 of them in this class, Lincoln Keenholz and Chase Van Tol.
All right, so that's 11 AA. AAA. This was really difficult to pin down. Honestly, there were so many great individual players among just 9 teams, but let's go through the honorable mention list because I think the 2 finalists might be just a teensy bit controversial.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, David. There's going to be some controversy because you could pick so many different players. And in this class, we have so much talent because these schools are so big. You have to be so good just to start on one of these teams, let alone be a star. And let's talk about some of those stars on the year. Bennett Dannenbrink, an absolute warrior. The thing I like to point out about Bennett, he had nobody on his offensive line really for most of the year that was over like 220 pounds. He had to run for his life a lot and still made huge play after huge play. He set the record at O'Gorman in his second year there, all-time passing yards. He was dynamite. How about Abraham Myers, the future Bison? He would get after quarterbacks at an alarming rate. He had a 4-sack game earlier in week 3 this year. He's a 2-time All-State defensive end and is a true wrecking ball. He stands out. He's one of those guys that just stands out on the field. Ryland Satter, just a junior, but get ready, folks. Ryland Satter is amazing, and he was actually in consideration for me for the finalists here because not only what he does on offense, 17 yards per catch, found the end zone 15 times, but also he was their best defensive end. He was out on the field almost every play for O'Gorman because of their lack of depth. And why wouldn't you want this guy on the field? He was phenomenal for O'Gorman all season long. Let's move on to Tate Schaefer. Only one quarterback in this class threw for over 3,000 yards. You know who it was, Dave? It was
Tate Schaefer.
Tate Schaefer. 3,108 yards and 35 touchdowns. And he's another guy whose accuracy seemed to just exponentially improve as the year went on. Last year, that was one of his issues, was throwing the ball away a little bit too often. And this year, 68% passing with those huge offensive numbers. Remember, he's just a junior. He'll be back next year. That's kind of a theme in 11 AAA. He's just a junior. He'll be back next year. Another one of those juniors, Titan Tryon, the receiver for Harrisburg, just a big play threat. I love that he wears number 84 as well. You'll see a lot of these receivers wearing the single digits or the teens, but you have to imagine that's a Randy Moss.
That's a Randy Moss. It's got to be a Randy Moss.
It's got to be a Randy Moss shout out. But he kind of looks like Randy Moss. 17 yards per catch, was at or near the top of almost every statistical category for receivers in 11 AAA. He's definitely one of the best in the class. How about Nelson Wright, though? I think he was the difference for Jefferson this year. Last year, their running game definitely needed a boost. He transferred in from Roosevelt, and boy, did he give him a boost. He was out for about 2 games this year and still ran for 1,300 yards, 19 touchdowns. One of the absolute missing ingredients that came back and played in a big way. And then how about Jack Smith?
My goodness.
I mean, my goodness is right. He had some incredible performances, none better than his receiving record-setting day in Rapid City when he absolutely went off and won the game ball. His season, he led the class in yards. He led the class in touchdowns, over 2,000 yards. And again, we're talking about a junior receiver, Jack Smith, who was phenomenal this season. So we could probably go on. Again, like Jody said, we're probably missing some linemen. We're probably missing some defensive players. They were all outstanding, but how can you leave any of these guys off an honorable mention list?
And it goes to show you the level and amount of talent in this class that Jack Smith is on the honorable mention list. He and Satter, we were debating in the office about putting them in the finalist list, but the reason we are going to have these two finalists is just because Jefferson was just so dominant, probably the most dominant 11 AAA team we've seen since the class was introduced in 2013. And so both of your finalists are Sioux Falls Jefferson Cavaliers.
I think it becomes evident as we make these award lists just how talented this Jefferson team was. They probably have 9 players on their defense that are going to be college level starting players, and they probably have another handful on offense. But the two guys who really stood out for their team all year, Talon Ashley at quarterback and Griffin Wilde, an unbelievable player who decided to play some defense this year and made himself one of the best cornerbacks in the class. Let's start with Talon Ashley, though. He was pinpoint accurate this year for a quarterback to throw 30 touchdowns and just 3 picks, and for him to be as consistent as he was throughout the year. And then we saw it every time he's in trouble, he can make plays with his legs, and we saw him do that in the championship game in the second half of the season. Not as much as last year, but he didn't have to as much this year.
And that was kind of the thing we talked about all season with Jefferson, is that Ashley had that ability to make plays with his legs, but he didn't have to. Just everything around him was so great, but he was also the straw that stirred the coffee. He made that happen. He made that offense go. And as you mentioned, Griffin Wilde, he missed a couple games this season, we grant you that, but just from a receiving standpoint and a playmaking standpoint, we had coaches debating and arguing single coverage versus double coverage, and no one could agree. I think that's the sign of a great receiver, that you don't know how to guard him.
He makes the players around him better just for that reason. He takes so much attention on the field, and we saw it right away from the first game of the year when they played Harrisburg and he came up with 171 yards receiving. People said, we've got to eliminate this guy and not let him have games like that, or we're just asking to lose. And that's kind of what happened. But he put up a tremendous year. His impact goes far beyond the circus catches that he can make. And what I thought was the most interesting this year is, he had a little injury in the offseason, didn't get to receive very much, so he kind of worked on his defense, and he went up to Coach Benedetto at the beginning of the year and said, hey, I want to play defense, and Coach said, nothing is given, everything is earned, so he had to go out and show him what he could do on defense, and of course, the way Wilde does it, he went out and showed what he can do on defense and became one of the best cornerbacks in the state. So we don't normally pit two teammates up as finalists in the finals here for you to vote on, but we just couldn't go any other way. And after talking to a lot of coaches, I think they agreed that these two were the reason that Jefferson had the year they did.
Of course, Talon Ashley's going to play basketball next year at the University of Sioux Falls. Griffin Wilde is going to play football at South Dakota State. But as you mentioned, the amount of playmakers on Jefferson, you mentioned Nelson Wright. Nelson Wright was hurt for a couple games, but he was clearly one of the best running backs in the state. And then there are some guys that weren't even on your honorable mention list. Guys like Max Carlson at Harrisburg, Dylan Langrock at Brandon Valley. I mean, there is so much depth of talent in AAA. It's unreal.
Exactly. You even look at Mandela Mohammed with a great defensive back for Washington who had an outstanding year. You go to Roosevelt Jackson Gravengood, and I'm not sure if I'm starting a team, I wouldn't pick a guy like that to get started with. Yeah, there's a lot of talent to talk about, and there's going to be a lot of talent back next year because a lot of these guys are juniors. And I hate to, fast forward because we want to celebrate this year, but man, we are going to have some really special years to talk about next year.
That we will, but Jefferson is your 11 AAA state champions, and the Cavaliers represent your 2 finalists. Again, you can vote on all of these players online. Tell them again how to do it.
Yeah, you go to midcosports.com. You can check out our blog. You can't vote directly on all of our social medias. If you want to vote directly, you got to go right to our Instagram account. That's where we tally everything. But everything will lead you to the right place if you go to the blog, midcosports.com. Check out all these stats. You can do your own research and see what you would have done. But once again, some really good candidates. In 9B, Brendan Begeman and Landon Puffer. In 9A, Hunter Kramer, Rylan Peck. 9AA, Cedar Amiot, Ryan Krogh. In 11B, we've got Swadek and Barfus going at it. In 11A, Braden Panconen, Justin Zerpel. AA, we've of course got Lincoln Keenholtz going up against Chase Van Tull. And in AAA, the 2 Jefferson teammates of Wilde and Ashley.
Lots to vote on. Go to midcosports.com to make it happen. Thanks for watching Varsity Sports Live all year long. For our entire production crew, Jody Norstedt and Jason Andera, I'm David Brown. We'll see you next year on VSL.